I guess just to get started, so my name is Christine Chapman. I'm the programs director for Uplift.
I'm Jennifer Dorsey. I'm the communications director for Uplift.
And so Uplift is a nonprofit dedicated to combating sexual violence in online communities through education and advocacy. So the reason that we're kind of having this panel and the reason we're here at MAGFest is that we really believe in the power of the gaming community and other online communities, and we understand how important and impactful those can be for people, and we want to work to make that safe for everyone. That's kind of our overall mission, and that's kind of why we're here today. Some initial statements, just so that we're all kind of on the same page. Obviously, this is a pretty big room, which is great. We're really happy you're all here tonight. We're going to try to have this be a combination of us talking as well as a discussion. Given the amount of people there, some general guidelines is, there's a lot of people. Potentially, many of you have great things to contribute. So ideally, try to not be taking up a large portion of the conversation. So probably what we're going to do for the discussion part is have people raise their hands, and we're going to call on people and recognize that if a lot of people want to participate, we're probably not going to call on you multiple times in a short period of time. And it's not that we don't think you have something valuable to say, we just want to make sure everyone can participate in the conversation. Along with that, as you may have implied from the title, with the concept being MeToo and sexual harassment and assault being clear subjects that we may be talking about today, I just want to throw out a general warning about that and kind of remind people that it's completely fine if at any point during this conversation you feel like you need to take a mental break. Feel free to go on your phone for a bit and distract yourself with something else, or step into the hallway for a bit or for the rest of the panel. No one is going to be implying anything. There's a lot going on at MAGFest. There's a lot that could be going on, but just make sure you're taking care of yourself during this conversation, and that's more important than you being fully here for the whole conversation. The other thing is that this is a very broad discussion. We only have an hour here tonight, and so we're going to be talking about certain things. We're not going to be able to cover everything. So recognize that we may not be able to go in depth on every subject that you may want to talk about tonight, and we'd be more than happy to discuss that one-on-one, maybe afterwards. We have a booth in the expo hall, and I'm sure that all of you that are meeting each other here tonight can have those discussions, and kind of continuing to have the discussion is obviously the overall goal. We're not going to be able to tackle everything in this 1 hour. What we are going to try to tackle is the Me Too movement, of course, its intersection with the gaming community, and positive steps for moving forward as a community together. It's definitely easy to spend the whole time hashing out a lot of the problems that we're experiencing, but we wanted today focus just on the positive things, not just on the positive things, but overall on a positive way that we can move forward together as a community. So we may at times have to kind of redirect the conversation just in the interest of getting through this discussion tonight, and really appreciate your patience with that.
Yep, that's awesome. So we wanted to start kind of talking about YouTube, and this is why. So that's actually kind of where Uplift's origins come from. A few years ago, was it 4 years ago now, there was essentially a Me Too movement in the YouTube communities. There were over 70 survivors who came forward and made allegations for many prominent and well-known YouTubers. Some you may have heard of, some maybe not. And it was a months-long effort where people were telling their stories, they were being supported by their communities, and change was starting. That was 4 years ago. We are still both active in the YouTube communities. We're still very involved, and we know there's still work to do. We still have constant conversations with people in the YouTube communities about things we can change. We see some old bad habits coming back. Sometimes we see some of the people who were called out and even admitted to allegations coming back and gaining followers and talking about the problematic areas of that. So what that kind of underlines is, yes, the Me Too movement of now is incredibly important and incredibly powerful, and is going to make a lot of change. But even as the initial excitement, for lack of a better word, of it dies out over time, and that may take some time because it still hasn't quite, it's going to still be so much work that we'll have to do together, and we have to be careful not to lose all the ground we do make during the Me Too movement, because it's very, very easy to lose ground once people stop paying attention. So I kind of wanted to underline those examples because while there's plenty of differences between the YouTube community and the gaming community, there's also a lot of similarities. A lot of people make friends that they only experience online, either on YouTube or in gaming. A lot of people start to get into relationships through experiences they have in gaming communities as well as YouTube communities. Some people make some of their best friends in these communities. We all met online before we were an organization together and started a nonprofit. There's a lot of those connections that are incredibly important, and I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have at least one that you can think of. And so we wanted to make that connection because it's important and it helps to inform why we want to talk about some of the lessons learned from that, as well as, what we think we can do next.
Yeah. So speaking of the MeToo movement, just to make sure we're all on the same page, I think this is probably something that majority of you have heard of, which is why you're here. But so the way that I would kind of summarize what happened is, I think in general, 2017 was a year in a variety of different industries, everything from Hollywood to tech to online communities to gaming, a lot of different organizations and power structures, whether professional, whether online communities, experience this movement of change. One of the ways you can see this is the Time Person of the Year this year was the Silence Breakers, the people who came forward and shared their stories. So depending on what field or interests you have, like you may gravitate to one or the other. Some ones that come to mind for me is like Susan Fowler coming forward in February of 2017 with the stories about her sexual harassment at Uber and the way it was mishandled. And that was kind of from a corporate level. There were a lot of things later that came out from a Hollywood level. And a lot of people were fired or excluded from events or taken off Netflix or a variety of concrete changes. And so in the midst of all these public and famous people being called out in these situations by brave people coming forward and sharing these stories, there were kind of a few different things going on. I think one of them was a lot of people in these fields or in these communities were kind of surprised by, you would expect, like you've known someone for a while and suddenly you hear this thing that either they experienced or that perhaps they did to someone. And that can be kind of shocking. And a lot of people were very surprised by just the amount of people that were coming forward. And then towards the end of this year, the hashtag MeToo started, which was basically where a variety of people from all backgrounds, all communities came forward and shared that these public experiences that had been so talked about for all of the year were things that everyone knows people who are affected by these. And the idea that people could chime in and say, this thing that's been happening, this movement we've been a part of, that affects me too. And so for some of these people, they chose to just, tweet the hashtag with no description, besides maybe mentioning that this is what they were referring to. Some people use that as an opportunity to come forward and share their stories. For many of them, it was actually the first time that they shared that with certain communities they were part of, certain family members, certain friends.
Or even at all.
Exactly. And so it was pretty amazing to see the amount of people who came forward in this movement of showing that this issue is a lot bigger than perhaps many realize, and that can come in a lot of different ways. There's the realization that a lot of people that you may know have been carrying this burden, and this has been a thing that has affected them for so long. But there's also the feeling as a survivor that you're not the only one who experienced this, and there's a lot of people around you. And so it was a pretty amazing moment, and there were a few things there that I noticed that I think are particularly applicable. I think one of them is that, like a lot of big movements like this, a lot of people characterize this as a women's movement, specifically more of like a women's only movement, as in it was women coming forward and sharing. And I think in some ways that was very exclusionary in that it kind of made the survivors who identified as other genders feel like they were not part of this movement. And it kind of it kind of limited that in that sense. And so I think anytime we're talking about survivors, it's important to acknowledge that anyone, regardless of their background, this can affect anyone. And so we don't want to frame this as a women's as a women's only, like we would not for anything. Additionally, of course, there was a little bit of a stigma in the sense of while celebrating the people who decided to come forward, there was also kind of this implied guilt that people should feel if they did not want to come forward. And so one thing that I just like to say when discussing this is that, you know, no one is ever required to share their story in whatever way that means for them. No one is required to claim that they are part of MeToo. No one is required to go into extreme detail, and no one is required to be a part of this. And like, your story still matters, and you're still a survivor, regardless of whether you decide to tell someone. That's always your choice. And so while I really see a lot of hope and positivity in the MeToo movement, I do think that, like any movement, it has some general issues. So that's kind of like my overall summary of that. I think now we kind of want to transition a little bit into how it kind of affects communities like MAGFest and these gaming communities that we're kind of all here to celebrate.
And right before we do that, actually, I want to ask a question. How many of you, or let's put it this way, raise your hand if you or someone close to you has been affected by sexual assault or harassment. Now everybody look around. It's pretty impressive, right? It's important to underscore that there is no typical survivor. There is no survivor that is more important than another. Waiting 50 years to tell your story doesn't negate the fact that it happened. Telling your story to everyone you know isn't dramatic. Like, there's one of the biggest problems in the Me Too movement that has come up, and comes up especially with when people of note are accused, because often it's been people from a while ago or people who had questionable circumstances, or, you know, whatever, there's something there, is we police as a society. We end up policing their stories and policing how they tell their stories. And that's, you know, counterintuitive to the movement itself, because by nature, the Me Too movement is supposed to be one of inclusivity of everyone who has survived one of these experiences. And we use the word survivor because no matter how traumatic, for example, you consider your experience, no matter how violent or non-violent it was, no matter how long it lasted or who did it or where or how, you are still here and you are still functioning and you are still getting through, even if it's hard every single day. And so the word survivor applies very well. And if you as a person don't identify with that, even though you've had that, that's also fine. And I don't want to make anyone feel like they have to, but I wanted to kind of point that out because the policing in the community can sometimes drive me up a wall and make me want to throw my computer out the window, which is not ideal because it's expensive. But I think it's really important for us to, you know, recognize that maybe we've done it ourselves. Maybe we've second-guessed someone's story because it's just that berserk sounding. And you know what? Some stories are. And, like, you may have a story that is just like, you can't make this shit up, you know? And that's okay. But always, if you catch yourself saying, wait, how could this be real? This person must be making this up. Take a step back and be like, okay, wait. Why would someone want to admit they were a sexual assault survivor, face ridicule and people yelling at them, possibly be fired, all these other things? You know, I mean, of the tiny percent of the population that comes forward with false allegations, and it really is tiny, it's important to recognize that pretty much every survivor you know is telling the truth. So I just wanted to put that in there because it's actually kind of an important part of the transition we're making. And that's because I kind of want to talk specifically about male survivors. So
you want to do this?
Yeah, we're gonna put a quick video on in a second. We have a series called Engaged by Uplift. It's a YouTube series that we created a few years ago and are just bringing back.
On the screen.
It's there? Okay, cool. And it was an educational YouTube series, mostly vlogs, about sexual assault, specifically in online communities, but had a lot of overall topics. And one of the ones we did was on male survivors, because 1 in 16 men are survivors of sexual assault, yet they have a much lower percentage rate of disclosure than women. And that's saying something, because we all know how low the disclosure rate is for women. And part of this problem is that there's a lot of perceptions and cultural issues that come with being a male survivor and what that looks like. So I'll let the video speak for itself now.
Oh no.
Did it freeze?
Just working. The sound. Hang on. We're experiencing, a classic HDMI situation where I don't know
Slight
if anyone
technical
has ever
difficulty.
experienced that, where for some reason it always defaults to. Oh, it is now going through HDMI.
Oh, yep, I hear it, I think. Nope, don't hear it.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's weird because it was literally just working before. So the problem is because it's connected to HDMI, I can't do it through that. It has to go through the sound system. I wonder if the sound people are the ones that. Oh my gosh. So I can do it through my computer, which is obviously. What? Yeah, it's coming through my computer though, so I would guess that a majority of people can't hear that.
Oh, can you do it?
What? Okay, I guess I thought usually with HDMI that wasn't the case.
Where'd it go?
Exactly. So now that I have the sound cable connected, thank you so much. Yeah.
Sorry.
See if that helps.
While we're waiting, does anyone have any questions?
No.
In the moment?
Is it only?
Yeah.
That's super weird.
We're male survivors of sexual.
So now it's going through my computer. So because it's going through HDMI,
If you want to bring that point up,
normally
I'd rather you
should
bring it
go
up
through HDMI.
as a group, because it's a.
But I want. Since it's only hanging to the projector, separate audio system.
That let's bring up in a little bit. I'm okay with this. Let's bring it up actually, because I think it'll fit better in our next topic. But I'm happy to have that be a point. Yeah.
we can just skip the video if it's going to be a big
Yeah, no. I definitely would love to talk about it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sure. We'll continue, and then we'll come back to this. Thank you so
come
much
back
for
to that.
dealing with that. Appreciate the patience. Yeah.
Well, we'll come back to it. No big deal. We thought it was working. It wasn't. Oh well. Okay. So in the meantime, let's take a moment Actually, you know what? Let's go into the next thing. I think that makes most sense, and we'll come back to the video. So I kind of want to transition to talking specifically about the gaming community. So I have another poll question for the room. How many of you in gaming-specific scenarios, whatever you define that as, have witnessed someone, whether it's you or someone else, be harassed because of part of your identity? Okay, now everybody look around the room. Yeah, that's also pretty impressive. And every community has this problem. I don't want to make it sound like the gaming community is like worse than anything else. It's not. Every community has it, whether you see it or don't. There are times when maybe we've seen it more explicitly from the gaming community just because something big happens. But in reality, it's not necessarily more common. What happens in every community is there's something that defines that experience. So on YouTube, for example, and then we'll come back to gaming. On YouTube, for example, the thing that kind of defined it in a lot of ways was the creator-fan relationship, because most of the, not all, but most of the accusations were from people who were fans of a channel, and the person usually in most cases it was a male vlogger, but there were a couple of other options, and often a young female fan. And that was a lot about power dynamics, which most assault and abuse is. That was a lot about power dynamics. That was a lot about misuse of those power dynamics, and a lot about a culture where people became too famous too fast and didn't know how to handle it. Because a lot of YouTubers shot to fame overnight in the early days and then had this millions of followers and didn't know what to do with them. Mm-hmm. And they were young also when they started to become creators, and then grew up on YouTube. And so there were a lot of dynamics at play. I bring that up because that's a very, very specific dynamic. It's different in the gaming community. In the gaming community, you have more of a majority male population than female in a lot of cases, which isn't the case in every community. You have a lot of... Yep.
You can come up and help with
Yeah.
something, or
Don't worry, you're not interrupting.
we're just gonna keep talking. But yeah,
We're perfectly capable of we'll just ignore you. It's okay. Thank you so much for your help.
Everyone always does.
Oh. And you have maybe dynamics that are very different. So I want to hear from you guys. What is something that you have experienced in the gaming community that you think is specific to the gaming community and maybe not to others or maybe not to many other communities? Yes.
One in
oh my gosh. Okay, it works. All right, that was very loud.
It is officially working.
Hear me.
Thank you so much.
This is why you never make fun of the tech geeks, because they always save the day. Sorry, we'll take care of this question and then go back to that. So, curly hair, yes.
Okay, so the first and only time I tried playing Icarus,
Sorry, is there any way you could speak up? It's
Actually, I'm going to close the
very
door.
hard to hear you. Yeah.
Because it's just a little loud from the outside. Go ahead.
okay, I had a friend who was really into Guns of Icarus, and they finally convinced me to install it and try and play it with them despite the 2-hour-long lobby wait times.
Yep.
Because there's all of 100 people playing Guns of Icarus at any one time. So we were in the lobby forever, and my username has my name in it, which is the second name. And as soon as we got into the lobby with other people and were preparing to play, there was a player, I'm fairly certain they were male, just judging by the voice, who noticed that I had a feminine name in my username and immediately started making masturbation noises in the mic, which led to me quitting the lobby before we even started the game and never booting it back up because there's almost nobody playing Guns of Icarus, and if I decided not to play with them, I'd probably never actually get to play a game. So it was super disappointing.
A, thank you for sharing that. And B, yes, I have heard many stories within the gaming community that are similar to that from women or from people who have, like you said, feminine names in their usernames or appear feminine in any way. And I think that is one of the things that's unique to the gaming community. There are some other communities where I think you would see something similar to that, but it is, I think, without a doubt, something unique to the gaming community in that there is sometimes this perception that because maybe, and there's a lot of reasons, and I'm, for the record, I am not saying anywhere near all men in the gaming community have this perspective. So just a disclaimer. So please do not think that. Thank you. Okay, so this perception that women, especially because often there were in the community, there may have not been women at first in some of the games, or women maybe came later at some points, or maybe women are seen as not real fans, or women are seen as people who are there to be made fun of. It depends on what cultural background that person is coming from. And a lot of women I have heard have experienced that in the gaming community. So your story is a very good example of what I was asking. So, was there? I think there was another hand over here. You were next, I think. Yeah. Thank you, guys. We'll get to you.
Video, or?
Let's do 2 or 3 of these
Sure,
and then
yeah.
go straight to the video.
One thing I just wanted to say as we're transitioning to this, as we saw earlier, whenever most people were raising their hands with respect to this is something that has affected them or someone close to them, just as we're having this discussion, I'm sure you were already going to do it anyway, but just a note, let's try to all just, keep in mind that people may have had real life experiences either with them or people close to them, and so maybe the tone you want to strike when having this discussion is one, understanding that this is a real thing that has affected people, as we just saw by this one example. So I just want to clarify that, yeah.
And also the other thing is, try to keep the stories you hear in this room to this room. People who are telling their stories, it's incredibly brave to say things out loud in front of strangers. So just let's respect that together. Okay, go ahead.
Well, the main time I see it is, well, for me personally, it was in Overwatch, but any sort of competitive game, especially team games, where either your skill level is assumed beforehand because you speak or if you lose, it's blamed on you because you're the only girl on the team, and they say, hey, you're a girl, you're not as good, or any of those types of situations. I see it a lot in those team games.
Did most people hear that? How many other people have experienced that exact same thing? Yeah. That's definitely something that's specific to the gaming community. Thank you. Others? Well, we'll do 2 more and then we'll go to the video. Go ahead, right there.
Yeah, I think gaming communities are interesting specifically because they lack the physicality of physical corporeal spaces,
Yep.
with the notable exception of things like voice. And so to build on that last story, I think that the policing of voices that are either female or not female enough or not male enough, depending on the community in question, is really problematic in respect to creating these inclusive communities, be it in a single online game or on a forum about games, etc. And that can be very difficult both for survivors of past abuses and for individuals suffering new abuses moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. The lack of physicality, and this is something we see in a lot of online communities. So, you know, we bounce between a lot of different online communities, and something we see in probably most, if not all, is that, and you see this on Twitter too, right? Or like any place where someone can be relatively anonymous is, for some reason they think they can say things they would never say out loud in person to someone. Like some of the things I see, I'm like, there's no way you would say that to a random person on the street. A, you'd probably get punched in the face, and B, like you don't have, like people have more guts or something, you know, whatever word you want to use to attach to that. And I think that's definitely one of the characteristics of gaming in particular, I agree, and it carries over into often gender-specific discrimination. And or like you said, if you're not enough of something. And that's true for male too, if someone feels like they're not male enough. Because there's this idea you have to be a certain type of male sometimes, especially in certain games, you know? I know that not every gaming community is like this. I don't want to make the perception that all games are like this, because I've actually heard of some really inclusive, wonderful gaming communities who really put an effort on this. But, you know, there's exceptions to every rule on both sides. So thank you. The last one, tie-dye. Great shirt, by the way.
I found something kind of weird in the Pokemon community.
Okay.
I grew up in San Diego, lived there for 12 years of my life, then moved all the way across country to Maryland. And when I moved, I had all these people like quizzing me on the specifics of Pokemon because they couldn't believe that I was into Pokemon. And like I'm ADD, so I have a hyper focus into Pokemon. And it was just looking back on it. At the time, I wasn't frustrated, but looking back on it, it kind of frustrates me. Just like I can't believe you didn't believe me just because I'm a girl.
Yep.
Because I'm into something with gaming.
The nerd girl quizzing, yeah, that happens a whole lot. You have to be at a certain level of knowledge to enter the room. Yeah, this happens in like, gosh, this happens even in your field too. Like this is, it's specific, it happens a lot, right? But it happens in, you see it a lot in like comics. You see it a lot in, like you said, Pokemon, I've heard about it a lot. Anywhere where like you have to really understand a world for people to think that you're good. I mean, heck, the Harry Potter community, which is something both of us are pretty into, even there, where actually the Harry Potter community is overall very inclusive, like they're pretty good at it. Even there, sometimes you see people be like, "You're not a real fan because you only watch the movies and not the books," and blah 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 blah. Like it's like, sorry, shut up. But you know, and I agree with you. So I think that's something that you see a lot in fan communities. But I think the quizzing of women in particular in gaming communities in specifically, I've seen that a lot, as well as like I said, comics in particular. So those are good examples. Let's switch to the video, and then we're going to go back to finishing up talking about gaming communities.
Yeah.
I'm filling in for Kat Lazo this week to talk to you about male survivors of sexual assault. Male survivors? Really? Mostly I've heard about women being sexually assaulted by men. Who are the male survivors? Unfortunately, although statistically there are fewer male survivors of sexual assault and abuse than women, it is largely agreed that 1 in 6 boys under the age of 18 will suffer some form of sexual assault, which is about 16% compared to 1 in 4 for girls, which is 25%. Yes, it is less for males, but not that much really. Consider this. At a normal basketball stadium, there will be about 17,000 people in attendance, if it is a decent game. Let's say that half are men, which means that around 1,360 male survivors of childhood sexual assault or abuse will be sitting at the game. Think of all the stadiums and all the games, and that is still a very small percentage of survivors in America, not to mention the world. Masculinity gets in the way of reporting. The defining attributes of masculinity, strength, autonomy, fearlessness, solving problems on their own, wielding swords, not asking for directions, makes it very difficult for men to step forward to talk about their abuse, so we don't tend to hear about it, and the media seems less likely to talk about it. Consider the current media attention to rape and sexual assault in the military. Even though women have a higher percentage of assault, there are many more men in the military, and therefore many more male rape and assault victims. But that is not what the media reports on necessarily. Being a strong man and admitting to even being a victim, or even contemplating the fact that they might have been assaulted, creates real barriers for men trying to find help. Look in your local city for rape crisis centers. The vast majority will be designated for women and may not mention men as victims at all. Luckily, this is slowly changing as more men step forward, seek help, and share their stories. A new distinction: forced to penetrate. For a very long time now, there was a myth that men and boys who were sexually mature could not be sexually assaulted unless they were actually raped by another man. However, relatively new thinking has drastically changed this viewpoint. The male body responds to touch, no matter what is going on emotionally, so it is possible for a young man to get an erection, even though that is the very last thing he wants. He can then be forced, whether the force is emotional or physical, to engage in a sex act. This is assault and abuse, and is now recognized as such by the law of the land. So, the 14-year-old boy who has sex with his female teacher is in fact being raped, even if he ejaculates, just as if it were a 14-year-old girl and a male teacher. Some of the new research from the Center for Disease Control rates the highest of all sexual assaults on a percentage basis is from incarcerated male juvenile offenders by their female guards. For this week's call to action.
Okay. So we wanted to show that because, as you can see, there's a lot of misconceptions about male survivors, coming often heavily from other men themselves, because there's all this perception that, for example, if you were assaulted by a woman and you're a man, there's something wrong with you. How many of you have heard that? Right? It's this perception of fragility. It's this perception of not being good enough. And, all of us deal, no matter what we identify as, all of us deal with that in some capacity, because being good enough is such an important thing in so many places. But it's really important to realize that never, ever, 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 if you are harassed or sexually assaulted or raped or in any of those worlds, anything you identify something as, is it ever, ever your fault? Nothing you can do welcomes that, right? Whether no matter how you identify, no matter what you're wearing, no matter how much alcohol is in your system, no matter what drug you took, no matter how late you were out, no matter what street you walked down, right? So, but for men in particular, it's hard to see that because it's really hard for them to come forward because of, even the police. Some police departments are better than others, but when the police question any survivor, sometimes they'll ask questions that are very, very victimizing and blamey, whether they mean to be or not. But it can often be worse for men or for people who don't identify as male or female, or for people who identify as transgender, or anything outside of the normal binary, because either the person questioning doesn't understand and doesn't know how to process that information, or they truly have a bias against it, or they think there's no way this is their fault. They're making this up, So I wanted to kind of go back to the MeToo movement 1 second to kind of give an example that I think is really resonant. How many people heard about the Anthony Rapp story? Okay, good, a good chunk of you. All right, so for those who didn't, real quick recap, Anthony Rapp is a actor most famous for being in the original Rent on Broadway. Super awesome actor, great voice, really into gaming actually, so he's probably active in some gaming communities. I know he's a big video gamer. Anyway, he came forward pretty early in the Me Too movement after a lot of the big accusations happened. And said that, oh my God, what's his name? Thank you, Kevin Spacey. Totally blanked his name out of nowhere. Kevin Spacey, when Anthony was about 13 or 14, had attempted to assault him by basically pinning him to a bed and groping him, which actually is a form of assault. He was trying to go farther than that based on Anthony's explanation. He never told that story to anyone else. Well, he told it to family and friends later on, but he'd never spoken publicly about it before. And there's two things that were interesting from that story that kind of are on both sides of the spectrum. One, Anthony is a man, right? Identifies as a male, says he's a man. Almost immediately, as soon as he told his story, yeah, of course there were people who doubted him. Like every single survivor goes to that no matter who they are. But overall, Kevin Spacey's career went down right there. Yeah, then more people started coming forward and it became very clear that this guy's got a problem. But pretty much Kevin Spacey was done right there. Netflix made their decision. It was clear early on. It took, in most cases, at least 3 or 4 women for every other case for that to happen. And Anthony said this himself. Like he readily said, I know that my story for some reason is having more impact, and he knew it was because he was male. He also said he was standing on the shoulders of a lot of women who'd come before him. And like we said, not all survivors are women, it's just that we had a lot of women coming forward. The other thing that was interesting, which is on the other side of the spectrum, is that a lot of the, even in the media, a lot of the response was, wait a second, that's not assault. How could that possibly, like, why is he complaining about that? What's the big deal? Or clearly, like, why was he sitting in a room by himself? Where were his parents? Where was his parents was the most common thing I saw. Like, and you know, and that's a whole bunch of things. And it was very clear that there were a lot of, whether purposely or not, homophobic statements going on. Even people, there may have been people who don't realize they're being homophobic in their statements because they're so those things are so ingrained in them. You know, because you can say something discriminatory without realizing you're doing it. So I wanted to point that out because I think it illustrated two very different but very important parts of the movement and how we can attack it going forward, and that I think applies especially to the gaming community because odds are, given the number of men who are active in the gaming community, odds are there are a good chunk of survivors there, just numbers-wise, right? So we want to think about that, and then we also want to think about, of course, the high percentage of women who've experienced something in the community too. But you want to, and across the spectrum, anyone who identifies as any gender, but knowing like the numbers-wise. So I wanted to point that out in particular. Sorry, I want to make sure. Let's see, where are we?
Back to discussions.
Yes, we're back to discussion. Okay, so going back to the gaming community specifically. Actually, let's do this. I know there were a couple other people who wanted to give examples that they'd experienced, and I don't want to, and we have enough time to go into that right now. So did anyone else want to give another example? Your hand right there, I saw you right there first.
Yeah, going off Pokemon, I'm in the competitive Pokemon community for the video game.
Yeah.
And speaking on what you were saying about power dynamics, there's been a judge in my area that like frequently hits on all the like feminine-looking people at the events, and has also made like semi-pedophilic statements to one of my younger friends, and it's really creepy. So it's like I love being in the community, but I hate going to events because he's there, and I feel like he could do something like judgment-wise against me.
Yeah, that's actually a really good example of someone taking advantage of their power dynamic. They are in a place of power because they are a judge at all these communities, so they have to be there, right? And so the people who, like you, who want to compete, their choices are don't compete or deal with this asshole, right? And that's so similar to what we've been hearing in the MeToo movement of all these people, all these women in particular, the women who came forward, who said, the reason I never told my story was it was either come out and face losing my job losing my reputation, losing everything I love, losing the industry I worked my ass off to get into, or just deal with it and eventually move on from him and maybe like, you know, find a way to like avoid him all the time. Same thing, right? Yeah. And I think that's a good example of the similar circumstances. Other stories. Yeah, so we're going into the next section in a second. That's where it would fit perfectly. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I wasn't really I've always played my games my whole life. I wasn't really a competitive person until Overwatch came along and ruined my life. But one thing that happens is because it's a game where voice chat can either make or break, an entire match. I do use it every time, but I'm somebody who's non-binary. I don't identify as a man or a woman. So it's like when I come on, people tend to ask me the same question is, are you a girl or are you like a little kid? And because I do kind of sound like a 5-year-old. And it's like you kind of have this moment of what do I do because you want to win and you're not sure which option will help you win.
Yeah.
Because I've had moments where people, if I answered honestly, called me it or just other very objectifying things.
Yeah.
Or would throw a match and stuff like that just for giggles and whatnot. So it's like, once you're approached with that question, you have no idea what to do because it's like, do I lie and potentially cause more anxiety to myself just for the sake of winning this game? Or do I tell the truth and just kind of hope and pray that, they won't care? So it's...
Make a suggestion.
Yeah.
Because of that. If someone asks, like, are you, like sometimes you get well, hey, you black or something? Just be like, does it matter?
Yeah, that is a very good retort. I've actually retorted with that sometimes, like, why does it matter? And so usually that does actually shut them up. But and then another one of the best Mercy players in the world recently came in, a trans woman, and a lot of people were supporting her, which was great. But there was also a lot of people who sort of found that as a further excuse to attack her because she was also a Mercy player. People tend to not like Mercy players for some reason. I don't know. So.
Well, A, thank you for sharing that. B, I'm sorry you've experienced people who really need a smack in the head. And C, I think you've hit upon something that is also very specific to certain gaming communities that I hear a little too much of from some of my friends who are also active in gaming. For non-binary, I have that alarm. For non-binary folks, in other communities too, I've heard people go through that as well. But I think it's specifically difficult in gaming communities because, like I said, people feel like they can say whatever the heck they want online. And I like that suggestion of why does it matter? Because sometimes. And of course, it's up to the person who, if you're experiencing it, being like, sometimes you don't have the energy for that, and sometimes it's a perfect retort. It depends on your mindset at that very time in the moment. And always make sure you're doing the response that's taking care of you, whether that means, for some people at that moment, fighting back is the most life-giving thing they could possibly do, and they're like, you know what, screw you, I'm going to be who I want to be. And for some people, they're in a place where they're like, you know what, I don't have the energy for this isn't worth it right now, I'm going to either lie because I just want to play a game and do my thing, or I'm going to step away and wait till I'm ready to go back. And eventually, it'd be really nice if there were more options than that, but I do know, and that's the change we want to work towards, which is a really good transition. So we're going to transition into what's next. I know that I know you wanted to put your comment in. I think that really comes in because we're talking about how to move forward with listening to people's stories as well. So why don't you go ahead and start off, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, well, I know this might sound like reactionary dogmas, but it is very important to judge the veracity of stories on our own. Not that people shouldn't be making stories, but to judge the veracity of them, because every single truly false story that is proven to be false by reactionaries undermines it.
I definitely don't disagree with the end of what you said, because every time someone, a really truly false story, and I will put a caveat in there, and I just want to add this. Sometimes, because when a story comes out in the media, right, it gets like sliced 6 ways to Sunday. And, you know, we see it all the time. If sometimes when a story comes out as not provable in the media, I'm talking specifically media right now because that's the best example, we automatically go to, oh, then it means it's false. And that's not always the case. I just want to point the distinction because sometimes a story comes out and because of any number of factors, because honestly, sexual assault and harassment can be very hard to prove, especially on a legal level because there's so many things that are required. And when we're talking in the media, often we're talking about the legal level because often these stories come to light aside from the MeToo movement because they're going to court or because there were charges. And so just because something doesn't have enough evidence doesn't necessarily mean it's untrue. I just want to make that decision. I'm not saying that I don't want anyone to think that I'm not saying that there aren't people who come forward who say things that aren't true because I know that technically, yes, of course there are. And none of us in this movement deny that because you know what? It pisses us off too. I can't stand if someone says something that's not true because they are undermining every single survivor out there. They are making it 20 times harder for us to come forward and say, this is what happened to me. They are making it so that it's like, you know what, why bother? Because everyone's gonna doubt every word I say. Yeah. I myself am a survivor and my story wasn't provable. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to point, but I pointed out, but I agree that people should, of course, you know, listen to people's stories, think critically. I'm not saying don't think critically at all. So I think that's also a good point. I just want to note that just because something doesn't seem provable doesn't necessarily mean it's false. Just a distinction.
Yep. The other thing I kind of want to add, just in general, which I see as a misconception, not only for the gaming community but for a lot of communities, is that if you're talking about a legal level, like whether someone is going to prison or something serious like that, then yes, there are a lot of specific criteria that you have to meet. There's, you know, often a trial by jury, all that kind of stuff. When you're talking about other elements, like for example, whether someone should lose their job or whether someone should no longer, you know, you should stop watching someone on YouTube, or whether someone should still be given, you know, be a judge in a Pokemon, I kind of missed the term for what you're using, but like be a judge in something like that, or be, you know, a big member of a certain game, or, you know, have a lot of Twitch followers or anything like that. That does not require the same level of legal scrutiny and legal process. Whether you believe your friend who's telling you something does not require you personally going through that kind of level. And so every community is going to have its own kind of, you know, guidelines. Ideally, you have some kind of guidelines for like, what does it take to be a judge of something? What does it take to be a staff at MAGFest? What does it take to be something like that? And additionally, when we're talking about something a lot more low-key than that, something like, you know, having a lot of followers, or you deciding to watch someone, or someone being a star of a movie, or something like that, like, no one deserves to be in that prominent state. And so it's not like we owe them this huge level of, you know, going through something like that in order for that. I just like to clarify that, like, unless we're talking about a trial, going through that level is not really required, and that it's sometimes confusing for people, but I think it's just like an important thing to keep in the back of your mind, yeah.
And that's especially true, even if someone comes forward in the media, that doesn't necessarily mean that too.
Yep.
We'll get to questions in 1 second. I do want to make sure we hit upon, you want to hit these two?
Yeah. So I think that I like the example earlier where we were talking about like one option that you have if, you know, you're talking and someone is asking you a question that, you know, whether it's about race or whether it's about gender, you find inappropriate or not something you really want to talk about at the moment. And I kind of want to talk about other ways, both that you can do that yourself, but ideally, how can we as bystanders in the movement, you know, let's say you're also on the same game right now and that's happening, or you're in a chat somewhere, you're seeing this online, what are some positive ways to do that? And one of the things that I like to focus on is that, yeah, as the person not affected, you likely are less emotionally attached to this, and it's not something that you're being personally attacked. And if you have the energy, a great thing to do is work on supporting the person who is being harassed, or whatever we are talking about this case. And this can take a lot of forms. It can take, you know, let's say there's a whole argument going on. Maybe you're now, bringing up their points for them or reinforcing that instead of them having to take the energy and respond to all these comments. Maybe it's even more simple and lower key where you're just messaging them privately and saying, I'm really sorry this is happening. Just wanted to let you know I saw that. This really sucks, or something like that. And just letting them know that you're seeing this and you're kind of on their side and you're siding with that. One second. And just in general, if you're the person affected, it's a lot harder for you both to stand up for yourself at times, in that like the person is less likely to listen to you. Whereas if other people are coming to your support, that often will get more traction. And another thing to keep in mind is, depending on the situation, if let's say you actually have something in common with the person who is kind of attacking in this case, for lack of a better term, let's say, this is about race and you happen to be white and the person affecting this is white, or you're a guy and the other person is a guy, and in this case we're talking about, someone who's non-binary or someone who's a woman, and it's about their voice or something like that. Often you talking to that person can be better perceived, which is terrible. It obviously should not be like that. But we're all human, and sometimes for a variety of reasons we tend to listen to people more that we identify with in whatever way that means. And so those are kind of like two ways that I think about. Do we want to open up for other suggestions?
Let's just hit really quickly this one.
The third one?
Yeah.
Great. And I think the other element of this, obviously, is that, we're all human, especially in something like gaming, where likely, you're doing this to just relax after all the other stuff going on. A lot of times, maybe you're not hyper focused on am I saying everything right? Am I doing everything right? And it's possible that even the best intentioned people who are not truly terrible, make mistakes, and you are the one making someone feel bad, harassing someone, anything like that. I think that when that kind of thing happens, it's very hard to have someone message you or call you out, or however we're thinking about that, and say it can come in a variety of ways. Maybe they're specifically naming it and saying, you're being racist, you're being sexist, something like that. Or maybe it's more subtle and they're saying why are you acting like that? That can be really hard, because obviously we all know ourselves better than we know other people, and we understand the complexities of ourselves and can understand that while I made that weird comment, I actually have a lot of complex feelings on this topic. It can be really hard to be called out on something like that, and it doesn't usually match our vision of ourselves. But I think that taking the moment to, breathe and try to learn from the experience, whether that's talking to the person if you're actually confused and trying to understand their perspective without arguing with them, but just trying to listen. And then also hearing from other people, I think can also be helpful, especially maybe people outside of the perspective. But there's always a chance for people to grow and improve, and I think that taking that opportunity yourself, not to, close off and say, this person was completely wrong about me, I'm just going to completely ignore this, but try to understand their perspective. And often, even if you still end up disagreeing with them, you can have learned something in the process.
Yeah, all that.
Great. So does anyone else have suggestions for concrete things they've either seen or they could see applied? And we'll start right here, yeah.
I've done a lot of reading on bystander apathy and how it can be really hard to stand up to someone if you see someone being harassed. We're all social creatures. If I'm in a room and I see you being harassed and nobody else is speaking up.
Yeah.
But also, often what you'll find is once that one person steps up and says something, that's a social cue to everyone else. This is not okay, it's okay for me to stand up, and you'll see a ripple effect.
Yep.
People come together and actually fight back against it.
It's so true. Bystander effect is very real and is true in every part of the world. But it's totally right. If you are willing to be the first one to say something, even you don't have to say something even aggressive. You can say something just checking in with the person experiencing it and intervening just by changing the topic is a good first start, and others will often follow. That's something we teach in our bystander intervention.
Mm-hmm. In the teal shirt? Yeah.
I guess one of my problems or question I've had with that is in the gaming community, especially as someone who obviously identifies and presents as male, there's a huge problem with the first reaction to that being, you are a white man. And what ends up happening to me a lot, because I love Overwatch, I use it to play Dota, I just want to have fun. If I can win, that's nice too. And oftentimes if it's a girl or someone who's a different race, but And yes.
Yeah.
Here I feel safe, and here I
Sure, yeah.
people who understand that. And I'm not trying to make this about me right now. There are people who are experiencing it worse than me on average. But I feel like 9 times out of 10, I can't even help.
I want to point one thing out. Yeah, first of all, thank you for saying that, because it's not easy to admit that you go through that kind of crap. Second of all, what you are experiencing is harassment, and I want you to know that that is real and that is not okay. And 3, something that's important to know is if you are someone who experiences harassment and you find that you just can't, you don't have the emotional energy anymore to step into certain circumstances, that's okay. First of all, you're already doing more than a lot of people do, so A++. Second, we need to also understand that we need to support each other, and sometimes that means that someone isn't able to step up, and that is okay. But other people need to be stepping up as allies as well.
Mm-hmm. And I guess to address the initial, like the first half of that, where essentially while coming up and you're trying to help someone, and then you're being accused of, I think I maybe missed the term a little bit. White knighting. White knighting. Okay, I was pretty sure. Sorry. Essentially, like that is like a separate issue, like in itself, and I think that it's probably coming from a place where the person saying that, the people saying that is something that they've really experienced a lot of the time. It's likely not something that they just woke up one day and completely came up with that. But it's also like it's complicated because let's say to have it as a separate thing, like a whole bunch of people like wearing like an orange shirt are suddenly like throwing something at you every time you're in the hallway, and then another person comes up with an orange shirt and they're like not related. It's natural, but it's also like unfair in some ways. And so it's complicated. I think that depending on the situation, you're likely going to want to wait to like a little bit after, depending on if you still talk to this person, if this is someone you're interacting with regularly. Often like in the moment, fighting against that is like ineffective and also stressful for both sides. But if it's something you can kind of talk about later, when things have maybe calmed down with respect to the emotions of that like current issue. But it gets at a general idea is that like, one concept I really like is trust, intent, name, impact, which applies in a lot of different ways. But ideally, when someone is talking to us, regardless of whether they say something that we find offensive or strange or potentially ulterior motive, you want to like trust that they probably didn't mean that. But at the same time, like owning the impact of like whatever that made someone feel. And so it's kind of a balance, and I think that applies in a lot of situations.
I agree. I think it's a really good point.
Lots of comments, so let's try to get through those. Yeah.
I just wanted to respond to that, where even if the asshole who's doing harassing accuses you of white knighting, the fact that you spoke at all probably made the person being harassed feel a lot better. So even though the guy is still being an asshole, don't think that you didn't help.
Yeah.
You still helped. You probably made that person feel a lot less alone just in standing up.
Even if they're not able to say it at the moment. Yeah. Yep.
Yes.
So I used to, I love Overwatch.
I'm finding
a trend.
Yeah, I was
That's
gonna say,
great.
there's a theme in this room.
One of my favorite things about Overwatch, besides the diversity, even though I know that's a whole different panel within itself, is the fact that you can create custom matches. And what I like about the custom matches is I used to be able to create titles for different matches so that I could try to find community within the community. So me and like 2 or 3 more of my friends would come up with like the QT POC meetup. And then I would bump into other players who play Overwatch who know that code, and they know, all right, this is a bunch of queer trans people of color playing. And sometimes I'll do like the queer meetup or like the LGBTQ chat, and you end up finding a bunch of really cool people. And the reason why I want to share that is because this is something that I've done across the spectrum, whether it's playing Pokemon Go, video gaming, like across any like MMORPGs and stuff. It's sometimes being able to claim that custom space where you can be an admin and hold yourself accountable to what you're inviting in the space, and be able to have like more of a more freedom over what is declared safe at that time. I think that's a great way for you to be able to better navigate gaming and gaming culture.
Sure.
You know, even in like our experiences with like MAGFest and other conventions, there's a lot of conventions like PAX and GamerX, right, that have like meetups and like Reddits and tweet and like they do stuff like throughout Twitter and social media saying, hey, let's have this 1 hour where a bunch of random people who fall under this subcategory can just meet up and claim space instead of just assuming that the the developers or the convention, runners are the ones that are gonna have full autonomy over what's considered safe at one point. So I just wanted to share that with folks.
Yep.
Because it's something that worked with me. I'm a survivor, and it's something that I've seen other people do, and I think that it's great that people have that autonomy.
Thank you so much for saying that. First, before we do anything else, really quickly, I don't want to forget, I want to take a really quick picture. If you don't want to be in the picture, please feel free to tell me or say go away. But I just want to take a picture of how awesome y'all are. So you can wave if you want. Yeah, you guys are awesome. Okay, sorry. I'm the social media person, so
So obviously we've gone a little bit over time. I really appreciate, in general, everyone's attention and listening, and all the people who decided to share today. Even if you didn't share today, I appreciate the effort you put into that. I think we should probably wrap up, which I'm sorry about. This has been a really great discussion.
Yeah, you guys are great.
I will say we're happy to talk afterwards. I also think the fact that so many of you here are interested in talking about that, I think these are discussions you can continue to have outside of this panel in a more casual environment. If you're interested in learning more about Uplift and the things that we do to work in these spaces to make them safe for everyone, we're at Uplift Together on all social media and at uplifttogether.org. We are also in the expo hall if you have any chance of finding us or anyone in that giant room. Yeah, do you have any last comments or?
We're in the charity section of the expo hall. Please come see us. We'll be there all day tomorrow and Sunday morning. I just want to say a big thank you to everybody for being respectful, for being honest, for being willing to participate, for being willing to even raise your hand, because pretty much all of you did at one point. So you guys are awesome. I'm really excited, and I can't wait to hear from you all in the future. So thank you.
Yep.